Tonight on Wings, take off with the Discovery Channel and the Martin B-26. In its day, the Martin B-26 was the cutting edge of military aviation. The first of the night attack aircraft, the B-26 saw service in the air forces of all the major Allied powers during World War II. Its outstanding performance as a night attack medium bomber was due largely to its high rate of survivability. In nearly 130,000 missions, Allied forces boasted a loss rate of only 1%. Tonight, soar high with the Martin B-26 on Wings. The B-26 made its first flight on November 25, 1940, a sleek, modern-looking airplane. Just over 9 years before, on April 29, 1931, the United States' first mono-wing bomber had made its first flight. The Boeing B-9, with a crew of 4, sitting in open cockpits, could carry around 2,000 pounds of bombs over a range of 495 miles. It had a cruising speed of 130 miles per hour and a top speed of 165. Later versions pushed the speed up, but even 165 was a 50-mile-per-hour improvement on the biplanes that it was replacing. Boeing's metal monoplane was the parent of World War II bombers, but it was never to be built in quantity. In 1932, the United States, supported by a majority of the nations represented, was suggesting to the World Disarmament Conference that the bombing plane should be abolished. Even while such earnest wishes were being expressed, the Martin Company was producing a new bomber that was to eclipse the B-9. Elsewhere, Nazism was gaining support in Germany. Mussolini had been in power for 8 years, and the Japanese were casting their eyes about for an empire. Martin's new plane, the B-10, enclosed its crew and employed a rotating turret, flaps, brake main wheels, and variable pitch propeller. It housed its bombs internally and flat out could carry 2,200 pounds of bombs at 213 miles per hour, faster than fighters of the day could fly. The B-10 today looks recognizably modern, where the B-9 seems to belong to an earlier era. Yet little over a year separated their first flights. The B-10s were capable of operating under extreme conditions, a reflection of the growing understanding of the need for constant ready use of the airplane's power in total war. When the first B-10s appeared, they were a startling combination of the state-of-the-art, including all the latest ideas, from reduction of drag in the shape to the plane's embodiment of the strategic use of bombing might. They produced the result that all such breakthroughs achieved, which is to send the rest of the world's designers back to their drawing boards. For a time, it was the most advanced bomber in the world, and the Martin Company was justifiably proud of it. Martin builds bombers had long been a company motto, and building the world's best bomber gave them a certain satisfaction. A variety of engines powered different models, and mutations of the basic shape abounded. It even appeared on floats to lure the Navy's interest. Yet the mighty Martin plane, which broke so much new ground when it first appeared, was to be outdated by the time that war broke out. Though later B-10s unloaded had a speed of 260 miles per hour and a range of over 2,000 miles, they were appearing in 1938 when the Boeing B-17 was capable of doing that, carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs. The B-10 was lightly armed and carried a moderate load, so it seems fairer to compare Martin's plane to the twin-engine bomber that it replaced. The Douglas Company's B-18 had been the runner-up in competition with the B-17, yet due to economic considerations, it had ended up with the lion's share of orders in the couple of years that followed. Its performance figures are not more impressive than those of the B-10. Top speed had, after modifications to increase armor and range, fallen to only 215 miles per hour, with bomb load and range smaller than that of the replaced plane. Neither could have coped with Second World War combat. They lacked the performance, bomb load, and defensive armament of European contemporaries. In effect, the United States had no effective medium bomber available. One of the failed solutions in the Army's 1938 search for a twin-engined attack bomber had been the Martin Maryland, which, after sales to the French and British, had mutated in 1940 under British specifications to the Baltimore. It was to stay in production until 1944, seeing action in the Mediterranean. Designed 6 years after the B-18, with the war already teaching lessons, the Baltimore, like the original Maryland, had a speed over 300 miles per hour, carried around 1,000 pounds of bombs, and had formidable forward-firing guns. It was an excellent light attack bomber, but it never gained much favor with the United States Army. While the Maryland and later the Baltimore were being accepted in Europe, the U.S. planners had issued a specification in January 1939 for a new medium bomber with emphasis given to high speed, long range, and a bomb load of 2,000 pounds. Omitted from the specifications, yet implied in the target set by the paper, was that the plane would have a high wing load and high takeoff and landing speeds. In essence, the quest was for a plane that, while sharing many desirable performance and dimensional similarities to the Baltimore, would carry twice the bombs and double the crew. With war threatening, illustrating the urgency, and with conflicts around the world illustrating the needs, the parameters were extreme. What was needed were planes to push the limits forward radically, to overtake, not to catch up, to regain the lead once held by the B-10, and complement the excellent heavy bombers in use and on the drawing board. Martin's Peyton Magruder designed a plane that took a streamlined cigar shape and added the smallest practical wings and suitably powerful engines, and had a plane that immediately looked right. With a crew of 5, navigator, pilot, bomb aimer, and 2 gunners, it carried 3,000 pounds of bombs at 315 miles per hour. In carrying 3 times the Baltimore's load, it had only marginally larger dimensions, and its performance projections were such that it was clearly the winner in the competition. With the urgency of the international situation pressing, and Martin's reputation as a reassurance, the Army ordered the plane from the drawing board. There would be no prototypes. The first plane produced would be the first one deployed, and 201 were ordered in September 1939. The Marauder was to be armed with 2 50-caliber guns in the first power-operated dorsal turret on an American bomber, and had a hand-operated gun in the tail. Up front was a 30-caliber gun, socket-mounted into the bombardier's transparent nose cone. But as was the painful experience of all bomber designs in combat, the guns were, though effective in shooting down enemies, not effective as defense. The hard lessons about bombers needing protection or clear skies lay ahead. Additional guns were added to the plane fairly regularly, and later standard Marauders carried 11 50s. The interior, crowded with equipment, was starkly functional. It may have been home to 7 men for long periods, but it was anything but comfortable. The plane was an advanced weapon of war, free of embellishment.
A B-26 was in the bombardier's nose compartment, was very small. And for somebody at my height, about 6'1", 6'2", it's pretty tight. So what we did, of course, we were, not only that, we were supposed to kneel for the 4 hours because they did not put a seat up in front for us. We immediately found seats of some sort and where we could sit down so we could work a little better without being so tired and cramped.
Without the benefit of prototypes and test aircraft to assess the 26's performance, Martin went into full production and Marauders started to roll from the factory in increasing numbers. Despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles, this flow of production was to continue without interruption until the last B-26 was built in 1945. The first planes produced were assigned directly to the 22nd Bomb Group, an experienced formation which had been together for 2 years. With almost no fuss, the Marauder went into service with the outfit and was soon deployed to the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, operating initially from Australia in the New Guinea campaign. With the planes flying unescorted long-range missions, they received a lot of punishment and proved that they could take it. Among the planes flying into combat with the 22nd was the 3rd Marauder produced, and this was how its last flight ended. The 22nd, with experienced pilots and highly developed group morale, was a very effective unit. They had accepted their Marauders with enthusiasm, and as they flew them in combat, they became more and more vehement in their praise of the plane. They quickly reached the conclusion that their planes were the best of their type available, and they were not reluctant to say so. The support of the combat crews using the plane was to be very important in the coming months, as the Marauder back in the States was starting to gain a different reputation. Pilots in training were dying in their B-26s. The training school at MacDill Field in Florida was losing planes into the sea at a rate which spurred the rhyme, "one a day in Tampa Bay." To be fair, the figures averaged about one a week, but evidently something or a combination of things had gone severely wrong. The obvious conclusion was that the project should be abandoned. It was a hot ship, and it needed well-trained pilots, but it was in training pilots to fly it that the plane became known as the Flying Coffin. The Army was carefully selecting men after exhaustive physical and aptitude testing, and then was unable to prepare them for the weapon that they were supposed to use. The crashes continued, and the small wing spurred the B-26's new nickname, the Baltimore Whore, implying that the aircraft had no visible means of support. But though the Marauder was heavily loaded, in the hands of an experienced pilot, it flew impeccably. It had arrived in service concurrent with the expansion of the Air Force to undreamed-of size, and many of the pilots and trainers had little or no knowledge of flying twin-engine planes. To have your first hands-on experience after a docile and well-behaved trainer in something as ornery and powerful as the Marauder was simply asking too much of the recruits. If it had not been for the enthusiasm of the crews flying the plane in combat, the first Board of Inquiry into the plane might have scrapped the project in 1942. But to add to the praise from the Pacific came the experience with the Marauder in the North African campaigns. The British had taken delivery of some of the new bombers and had assessed them as suitable for tactical use and deployed them to the desert, where the crews, once again experienced, had been delighted with them and lost no time in advertising the fact. As the fighting went on and the German counterattacks lost their strength, more B-26s arrived in the theater and began operations. They were not only used as bombers, but as fighters, intercepting the lumbering German transports over the sea and dispatching them and their cargoes to the water below. The Marauders harried the enemy front lines and disrupted their supplies, both being brought up to the front and being shipped and flown across the Mediterranean. It was the strangulation of material that was to finally spell the end of the Axis resistance. Some German units fought to the bitter end, but once the Allies had wrested control of the air, the Afrika Korps was unable to sustain a defense. The jubilant French population welcomed its liberators, and there were parades and dancing celebrations to mark the exit of the Axis powers from the African continent. The German airfields had become graveyards for many of the Luftwaffe's planes, the wreckage standing as testimony to the effectiveness of tactical bombing. Meanwhile, in the U.S., inquiries into the accident rate in training continued, and new changes were made to the Marauder, including giving it a larger wing in an attempt to lower the landing speed and the wing loading. This was obviously needed, but what was just as obviously not needed was for the margin gained by this to be immediately sacrificed in adding more weight to the plane. However, the big wing was accompanied by another increase in weight, which swallowed the new area and left the plane with no improvement in wing loading. The figure now stood at 58 pounds per square foot, with the plane weighing over 37,000 pounds. With the big wing had come external gun nacelles and other innovations, and with each of these changes, it fell to the test pilots to assess the effect on the plane. Logically, particular attention was given to takeoff and landing behavior in this testing series. The testing of the plane tended to produce a repetitive result. In the hands of an experienced pilot, the B-26 behaved. Even flying 10,000 pounds more weight than the designer had targeted, the Marauders still made devotees of their crews, a powerful vindication of the design. The test pilots were, by the nature of their profession, very experienced aviators, and they appreciated what a B-26 had been designed to do. The Marauder was in every sense a hot rod. The test pilots came to know the B-26s very well, and significantly, a couple were retained at Wright-Patterson for general testing and for use as chase planes. While the furor had continued in America about the safety of the bomber, examples had been efficiently flowing from the Martin plant, and more groups of B-26s had been deployed. In the Pacific, longer-range planes took over, and the center of Marauder operations shifted to Europe. Serious doubts were expressed again when the second mission flown from Britain turned into a disaster, with the entire raid being lost to flak, fighters, and a collision. But as whenever these doubts were raised, cool heads pointed to the plane's obvious success in its place, and the Marauders were retained, though they were not to be used at low level for some time.
Lost an engine, then it was very critical on one engine, and if you pulled too much power on one engine, you sometimes lost control of the airplane. So this was what made it so difficult to learn to fly. But once you had an appreciation of these things, and were always aware that it could happen, then pilots began to love the airplane. Pilots that finally ended up in combat are those who survived the training missions. You know, the code word used to be a B-26 a day in Tampa Bay, but that was in the early days of training.
Europe was to be the theater where the B-26 proved itself in the long run. After the initial shocking loss, the crews settled into the hard routines of their work, and the Marauder's reputation grew more balanced. The fact that it was vindicated in combat is not surprising. Martin had put a lot of time and expertise into the plane, despite the rush to get it into production and use. Among other effects, the weight increases had led to a series of accidents caused by landing gear failure, and the wheel struts were strengthened. The Hudale bomber, trailing its loaded B-26 strut, put in many hours, and all the components were subject to the same thorough evaluation, though not always as bizarrely as this. tests evaluated different angles for the wheels. The infamous wings were not gambles. They were calculated to satisfy a need and with margin for safety. If there had been any initial inadequacy, the plane would never even have lifted into the air with the hugely increased loads that the Army subsequently expected of it. The initial calculations were proven. The plane, though demanding, was safe and reliable. A test program is of little use if it tests only favorable conditions. The test series on aircraft are often pursued until a part is destroyed, as in tests shown here, where a wing surface is brought to the point of buckling. The treatment devised for the components in these laboratory environments was, to say the least, extreme. There was no part of the plane that did not represent a deliberate and logical choice, sometimes with some compromise, but the designer's aim for excellent performance is evident from the choices made. With a small wing, heavy demands were placed on the pilot, or more particularly, on his training. Wherever it could, the company did everything possible to protect the crew, experimenting with many combinations of armored glass, for example, in seeking the ability to withstand the blows of bullets. But no amount of company design could protect the crew from the disastrous combination of the rapidly expanding Air Force and the intolerance of the Martin to mishandling. Not only trainee pilots, but trainee ground crew and mechanics contributed to the crashes. Once units had been shaken down and prepared to take up their place in the line, accidents diminished rapidly, and the universal acclaim for the B-26 from its combat users continued. In addition, in the hands of the newly formed 9th Air Force, it had found a role as the Ravager of Communications. With fighter cover, the 8 B-26 groups of the 9th assumed the role of medium-altitude, high-precision attack. The increasingly paralyzed Luftwaffe could do little to stop the process of surgically precise cuts made in communications all over the occupied countries. The momentum of Allied air dominance grew, and the effect on the Nazis' ability to resist invasion and defeat was critical to the war's outcome. The stable that produced the Marauder had also been responsible for the first production bomber designed in the United States in 1918. Martin was a company with a long tradition and a lot of pride, and the criticism of the B-26 had hurt them. Their workforce, highly skilled and highly valued, produced planes that were second to none, and the company's history of breaking new ground in planes that were practical, efficient, and well-built was a valuable asset. With gasoline rationing, the company organized transport for the workforce with car sharing arrangements and public transport. The war was felt at home not only in the carpools and reliance on public transport. The large numbers of women who came into the workforce reflected the fact that the country had placed so many of its young men at risk.
I'm Bob Lucas, Colonel, U.S. Air Force retired. The B-26 will be right back on wings.
Now, I think the B-26 is a great airplane, primarily because of its speed. It's being a rugged airplane. Several times on missions we had battle damage and came back, no problem. The thing could fly and go right back a few hours later and it would fly again.
In Europe, the B-26s went on with their task in a manner that became more and more efficient with growing experience. In the European theater, they would fly 129,943 operational sorties by war's end, dropping 169,382 tons of bombs. The loss of only 911 aircraft in combat represented a loss rate of less than 1%. To offset this, B-26 gunners were credited with 402 aircraft shot down. Together with other Allied attack and medium bombers, the Marauders reduced Hitler's empire to isolated centers with communications in shreds. Often flying in a sky crowded with different Allied planes, the Marauders pounded the Germans in the lead-up to the invasion, and then in the inexorable pressure and subsequent Allied blitzkrieg as the Allies fought their way toward Berlin. The Marauders found favor with the pilots of many forces. Not only did the British and U.S. Army and Navy buy them, but they were flown by French, Australian, South African, Canadian, and Greek crews. Photographic variants, target tows, and trainers appeared as the model matured, and it became the first Army Air Force plane to operate at night in the European theater. With wide acceptance, the Marauders basked in a good reputation, but it had been a long time coming, with a lot of hard and dangerous work along the way. In Baltimore, the last parts of the Marauder story were written as production ceased on March 30th, 1945. Before a small group, Mr. Martin made a short speech, and anticlimactically, a few photographs later, a chapter in aviation production had closed. The last plane, Tail End Charlie, was a model TB-26G-25MA, which gives some idea of the proliferation of types and subtypes since the original, simply titled B-26, had flown 3.5 years before. Tail End Charlie was fitted out as a target tow and trainer plane. The second-to-last Marauder, named Middle River Stump Jump and given an additional re-identification as the XB-26H, was, ironically, considering the takeoff and landing controversy that had surrounded the B-26, involved in testing the radical new undercarriage being developed for the Boeing B-47 Stratojet. It was modified to have tandem main wheels retracting into the fuselage and outrigger legs housed in place of the normal main members in the engine nacelles. The fuselage of the plane had to be specially strengthened with the external reinforcement you can see to take the landing loads of the bicycle undercarriage. Occasionally, the tests would be interrupted as the violence of some of the maneuvers saw gear failure in the cobbled-together assembly, which was made up with bits from B-26s and B-17s. Middle River Stump Jump was involved in preparation for the next generation of planes. And this next generation was to represent another great leap forward, as the jet engine would make the entire World War II inventory instantly outdated.
They got 11 out of 36 airplanes on the first time that ME-262s were used. That's quite a score. I remember the debriefing, and we kept asking all the tail gunners, all the gunners, everybody, what hit us, and nobody seemed to know. It was very confusing, and then that night we got a wire from 9th Bomber Command headquarters that said that we were hit by jet aircraft. And to a man, we all said, "What's a jet?"
I was so impressed with the B-26 that after the war, I went to the Martin Company while I was in college and worked there as a co-op student until I got my aeronautical engineering degree, and then stayed with the Martin Company for approximately 10 years, working on various missiles, rockets, and aircraft.
For some World War II bombers, there was a life after the war as commercial planes. But the Marauder, although rehabilitated in the minds of flyers, still experienced a mixed reputation. And given that it was more expensive to build than, for example, the North American Mitchell, the B-26 disappeared with astonishing suddenness. One day there were thousands of planes, and it seemed that the next day there were millions of aluminum ingots in their place. They were scrapped even faster than they had appeared. The French used them until 1947, and that was that. Abruptly, the B-26 Marauder was gone from the sky. The Marauders, ruggedly designed and capable of absorbing damage unshaken, played a relatively unsung part in the war, but a part of that was of the highest importance. The losses in planes and crews were the lowest for any U.S. type employed in numbers in the European theater. But there was a price to pay for victory, and some of it was paid with the lives of the B-26 crew. With the war's end, there were many airmen who could thank the Marauder for their survival. And there are still many B-26 men who will argue loudly that their plane was the best of its kind in the war. And there are still those who will look at the B-26 man as he says this and strongly disagree. But with adequate training of crew, both flight personnel and maintenance, and with better quality control over some of the subcontractors, the plane emerged from its infamous infancy to establish a record that, with due respect for those who remember the plane as the Widowmaker, tends to support the veterans who remember the B-26 as the Marauder. Even allowing for the controversy, there is no denying the B-26 an honorable place as one of World War II's best planes.